Welcome to the ODF Sweden webinar series, and it's our great pleasure to have Professor Uta Wehn with us today, and she will share with opening up marine science. And we know that open science is a global movement. It aims to open up scientific knowledge production and results and help to formalize it via a recent adoption, for example, of the UNESCO Recommendation of Open Science. So in this sharing, Uta will lead us and explore the implications for opening up marine science. Who are the actors in open marine science? Who is an open scientist and whom we will engage in the coming years? And Uta, let me introduce her. It's really our pleasure that we can have her with us today. She's the Adlerbert Visiting Professor of Marine Citizen Science for Sustainable Development at the University of Gothenburg, and also Associate Professor of Water Innovation Studies and Head of the Knowledge and Innovation Studies Development Group at IHE Delft. So she has diverse background. She's a social scientist from the field of science, technology, and innovation studies, and she also has a background in ICTs with more than 20 years of combined industrial, research, and international development experience. And she has participated in many intergovernmental processes and initiatives. For example, the OECD Water Governance Initiative, the Group on Earth Observation, and the recent UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science. So she has a lot of insights in this field, and personally, I also look forward to her sharing. So without further delay, Uta, please have the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yichin, for your kind introduction, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here for the Ocean Data Factory Sweden webinar series, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity to share my reflections with you on what it means to open up marine science. How I'd like to do this is to first of all outline really what is open science. Perhaps not everybody is entirely clear of what that entails, and also how we've come to a joint global understanding, let's say. But then also briefly pause on why we should care in marine science. Why should we care about opening up science and opening up marine science in particular? And then think through, well, what does that mean for us as marine scientists? What does it really mean in practice? And then I'll round off with some conclusions. So what is open science? So yes, open science is a movement that's been around for at least 2 decades. It means many things to many people and often different things. Some people focus very much on the open data and open access side. Others really clearly see citizen science as part of, the umbrella that open science provides. And yet others say, well, hey, there's a parallel movement going on between open science, opening up the scientific process, and what citizen science does in terms of engaging members of the public in scientific research. Are they the same? Are they partly overlapping? We don't have time to go into these, but just to outline, there's different thinking depending on which perspective we come from. But also from the policy landscape shaping science policy, we've had the thinking of the European Commission on this with its open science policy. We could argue that it's been slightly more focused on opening up research results and also data rather than the scientific process itself. But more recently, we've seen the formal adoption of the UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science. UNESCO, of course, being the United Nations Organization for Education, Scientific and Culture, has been appointed as a body to come up with a joint recommendation. So we can see that that's a step up from the European policy. Here, really, we had a process that tried to achieve a global consensus on what we mean by open science. So if we say that that's sort of the highest level of which we as a global community have reached a joint understanding, let's take a closer look of what this joint understanding consists of. On the one hand, it's very much a focus on collaboration and sharing for the benefits of both science and society. It's very much impact-driven science that helps to address societal challenges. It tries to make that knowledge openly available, but there's also a strong focus on opening up the scientific process of knowledge creation to a variety of actors. So the UNESCO recommendation goes as far as saying this is actually a new paradigm of doing science. We open up the content, the tools that we use, tools and methods for practicing science, but we open up the scientific process itself as well. This comes hand in hand with a nice illustration of what we might call the pillars of open science under the UNESCO recommendation. On the one hand is opening up scientific knowledge, but also opening up the dialogue with other knowledge systems beyond the science system, the open engagement of societal actors, but also making science infrastructures more easily and more widely available to various producers of science. And that is very nice. A recommendation as a policy instrument is very good, and that now feeds into the member states division of science policy. But of course, there are quite a number of steps involved. The promotion of this common understanding, as articulated in the recommendation, developing an enabling policy environment at the member states levels, typically done through the ministries responsible for science, technology, innovation, policy, but also more broadly fostering a culture of open science and investing in the human resources. If this is a new way of doing science, we need to invest in the capabilities and skills, promoting innovative approaches that go hand in hand with practicing this, promoting collaboration, how we roll out open science, but also investing in infrastructure and services. So you see there's quite a number of elements that come into play when we think it through in terms of implementing open science. But then why should we care in marine science? Why does it matter to us? So on the one hand, yeah, this new form of knowledge production, of course, doesn't stop here when we try to understand the ocean, which is a complex environment and has many impacts from climate change, population growth, lifestyles, etc., let alone from the biological chemical understanding of what's happening in the ecosystems. So the production of knowledge for a sustainable world is changing, and it certainly doesn't stop when it comes to the ocean. And as I mentioned before, these parallel joint synergetic movements of open science and citizen science have really pushed for a paradigm shift in how we co-create but also apply knowledge. Mainstreaming, particularly of citizen science, is very much happening within the context, in the European context, as part of the European Commission, the framework programs already under Horizon 2020, more recently also under Horizon Europe, but also under the United Nations Decade on Ocean Science. Citizen science clearly is recognized, and in the European context, the European Commission's mission Starfish 2030 pushes out the very ambitious target of having 20% of ocean data from citizen science. So a number of drivers, if you like, also pushing the marine science fields to open up and embrace open science. But then what does this mean in practice? We have the 4 pillars, so let's take a look at each of those for a moment, just to break them open and see what does it really mean. So opening up scientific knowledge, I think the 2 most common associations that people have is, on the one hand, opening up research data, on the other hand, making scientific publications open access. So it's not just subscribers to journals who can read scientific publications, for example. But also part of this is the opening up of educational resources in which scientific results are being shared, in which scientific practices are being taught, and open source software and hardware, the tools and methods that we use for doing science are also important elements of opening up scientific knowledge. When it comes to opening up scientific infrastructures, here it concerns both virtual and physical infrastructures, making these more equally available and trying to overcome inequality of access to research infrastructures. Open engagement of societal actors. Here we see a whole range, a whole collage of ways in which we can open up the scientific process. crowdfunding, but also crowdsourcing inputs into the scientific process, scientific volunteering, and then another shade of this way of involving members of the general public is also the citizen and participatory science approach, about which I will speak more in just a moment. And then in the open dialogues with other knowledge systems, this is really an acknowledgement of saying, yes, the science system and the scientific approach to producing reproducible knowledge, of course, is good and well. But there are other knowledge systems, particularly those of indigenous peoples who have transferred practices and insights in more informal ways. Local communities who are very aware of local challenges. We should actually open up the scientific process and engage in the dialogue with these, as well as with scholars who are perhaps disadvantaged because they come from marginalized communities, and particularly also developing countries. So yeah, that sounds good, but also very perhaps abstract and complex. And we could flip this around for ourselves and say, well, what does all this mean for us, as scientists? To begin with, who is an open scientist, or who will be an open scientist? So if we start from the scientific perspective, opening up science, of course, is very closely tied to the scientific process. So the scientific method as such is not suggested to be changed, but distinct steps of the scientific method can, of course, be opened up. And as I've argued before, it's more than just opening up the data or the final results. It's actually opening up the process almost at every step, if you go all the way to really engaging with new stakeholders at every step of that process. And also perhaps the important thing is to realize that this is not a sort of opt-in situation. Those who like, will open up science. The bigger setting is such that sooner or later, all of us will have to be open scientists. All of us will have to engage with ways in which we can open up the scientific process in our respective fields of expertise. And that, of course, will differ, just like our research methods differ. Also, the ways and the steps of the process that we can open will differ, but it will also require justification of how we are opening up and with whom. So another perspective of helping us to understand who's an open scientist is if we take a look at what the UNESCO recommendation proposes in terms of the values and the principles. So the values, let's say, is the why we're doing open science. Here are 4 items particularly highlighted in terms of the quality, but also the integrity of the knowledge being produced, knowledge produced for the collective benefit of society, that we strive for equity and fairness, both in the process and in the results that are being produced, but equally also diversity and inclusiveness of all segments of society. The principles are more about the how. How do we open up science, from a scientist perspective? So here is using transparency, scrutiny, critique, reproducibility, as principles for how we do science. The equality of opportunities across careers, perhaps, for example, of scientists, the responsibility, respect, and accountability elements of practicing science, which knowledges we bring in, which stakeholder views we engage, etc. Collaboration, particularly also across scientific disciplines, this need of tackling complex societal challenges in an open science paradigm is also very much cognizant of the fact that we need much closer collaboration between the natural and the social sciences to really understand and tackle complex challenges. Flexibility, as I said before, in terms of methods, ways of opening up science, and the sustainability of the approaches, also with respect to access to results and infrastructures. So quite a task here at hand. Then we could say, okay, if we go beyond, ourselves as scientists, who are the other actors in open science? And if we ask Google, we get a collage of mostly white men engaged in Hollywood in one form or another. And of course, on a more serious note, the picture is much more complex. So on the one hand, we have, actors that we would normally associate with academia. researchers, scholars, scientists, but also the management layers within research institutions, members of professional associations, and particularly also students, so scientists still in training and young professionals and their associations. On the other hand, we have a cluster of actors that we could say are more concerned with actually curating the knowledge being produced, communicating it, also with a view to science communication to the public. So we need a whole range of actors who are involved in providing that infrastructure and sharing the knowledge. Educator, creators, professionals, engineers from different fields, of course, come in with different relevant expertise and also in their role as educators of the next generation of scientists. Then we have a number of actors that we can roughly say sort of sketch the enabling environment for open science, the terms under which knowledge, scientifically not produced knowledge, can be made available, but also how it engages with their own practice as civil servants and policymakers. Money is part of the picture as well, of course, so research funders are part of this ecosystem of open science actors, and also a lot of research, of course, takes place not only in the public sector, but in the private sector. So relationship with representatives of the science, technology, innovation fields, of course, is also important. And then the elephant in the room, perhaps, or the most obvious actor in the center is end users of that knowledge, but particularly also the public at large, which we can stratify into communities, indigenous knowledge holders, civil society organizations, and citizens. So we see quite a complex ecosystem of actors involved in open science beyond ourselves as scientists and beyond the public as citizen scientists, if you like. So then how will we deal with all these peoples, and who will we engage over the coming years as we increasingly practice open science? So if we can take the example of citizen science as a way of opening up the scientific process, let's start small so we can see that beyond the scientists, there's the engagement of citizens and communities, but also often a much closer interaction with authorities, decision makers, policymakers who actually take decisions based on the knowledge being co-produced by citizens, communities, and scientists. We typically work on a project basis in science. So if we do a citizen science project and we do actually analyze who are we engaging then, if we do citizen science under an open science paradigm, we actually see this, there are these different actors, not only the core triangle of actors that I've just pointed out to you, but a whole range of actors in what we call the enabling environment, the regulatory entities, similar movements, the media, but we also may have opponents and critics to what we do, and we have to find ways of engaging them. And of course, there are also market forces at play, be it for the supply of tools and infrastructure, and also the eventual customers and buyers of results that we're producing. So it's a lot more than just engaging citizens as key stakeholders in open science. And of course, it requires the diversity of approaches. So yeah, how will we engage them? So if we stick with citizen science for the time being, and we benchmark ourselves against the way in which we've traditionally done science, as project owners, scientists, coordinators, project coordinators, we are typically in control of the process from posing the research question to designing the study, collecting data, analyzing it, interpreting it, making sense of the results, and then disseminating them and pushing those into action and publications, etc. Citizen science makes that process more complicated. I don't have time to go through these 5 C's, as they're called, these different forms, categories of citizen science. But I think you can even see, just at glancing at that image, that there are distinctly different ways of engaging the public in different forms of citizen science with greater or lesser control over the purpose of the study, but also in terms of how many steps of the scientific method we actually involve the public in. So these 5 C's, 5 different forms of citizen science categories: contractual, contributory, collaborative, co-creative, and collegial, really then provide some categories that are helpful for us to think through what are the dynamics of the different actors in citizen science, both scientists and the public. But all of this means that we actually need new skills. We need new skills as scientists in terms of engaging members of the public, also in terms of dealing with transdisciplinary collaborations. I mentioned the closer collaboration between the social science and the natural sciences already. We also need new incentive systems. Currently, we're as scientists not being assessed on how many people we engage and to what extent the science we do is actually driven by their needs, but typically more on the number of publications, the quality of the journals we publish in, the number of citations we've generated, etc. And this form of opening up science in whatever form actually also implies quite a number of new and additional resources, both in terms of infrastructure, but typically also in terms of time. We find in our citizen science projects that meeting citizens and working with them doesn't happen between 9 to 5, and it requires an engagement during evenings, weekends, so we didn't need additional resources even just in that respect. So to start wrapping up, I'd like to offer a few conclusions on what it means to open up marine science. Just let me reiterate, I think this is not an opt-in development. It's going to be the de facto standard of doing marine science. So opening it up is not an opt-in, but actually it's going to be the new normal, if you like. We do need to pay attention to the skills and the incentives for actually practicing open science, so that it comes from the idea and the bottom-up movement that we currently have, and the very broad policy framework from UNESCO, that it actually gets hand and feet and gets implemented on the ground. And then perhaps just to point out, okay, well, if this is all dazzling, you go, oh my God, well, where do I start? I'd just like to say, well, you or we are not alone in this. There's many different ways you can engage with like-minded practitioners, scientists, embarking on opening up marine science. So on the one hand, we have a marine citizen science community of practice that we started at the University of Gothenburg. On a more global level, we have the OceanCAN, the Ocean Knowledge Action Network, that brings together not only scientists, but also journalists and practitioners of co-design, of really co-designing ocean science and driving the practice of co-designing science into the scientific community. So that's at a global level. And then perhaps more thematically neutral, we have a community of practice that tries to bring together expertise from the sister movements of citizen science and open science. Under the Citizen Science Global Partnership, we have a community of practice that we set up 2 years ago that has global membership and participation from scientists and other citizen science, open science practitioners from all kinds of fields and interests. So it goes beyond marine science, but it's perhaps a very interesting forum to engage with these practitioners. So with that invitation, and say, feel free to join these different fora. I'd like to wrap up, and I really look forward to discussing the topic further with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uta. Yeah, open science is really a relatively emerging area or topic that has received more and more attention from both the scholar community as well as the citizens community, and of course maybe also the public, the general public, including the policy makers. Okay, so now let's open the floor to our participants. You're welcome to turn on your camera, microphone, and please feel free to share your opinion or ask questions.
I have a question. Do you have any example of a citizen science project in Sweden that has been successful?
Yeah, sure. I think within the marine sciences field, the Costa Seafloor Observatory, which a couple of the colleagues participating here also are involved in, is a good example that happens in the Swedish context. That's just, you know, an example from marine science. I know that colleagues at Gothenburg University are working on a whole range of projects, you know, engaging the public more broadly in environmental conservation. So I think there's no shortage in Sweden or elsewhere on citizen science projects. But if you wanted to check out a concrete one, the Costa Seafloor Observatory, I think in the marine context is a flagship.
Torsten, please.
Yeah, let's see if I can manage the technology. I'm visible on two screens here, I realize. Sorry about the confusion. Thank you a lot for this presentation, Uta. A question that might be on some people's mind, including myself, is this is, as you say, not an opt-in. This is something that will happen and actually already is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for the ones who feel really enthusiastic about this, such as myself and you, of course, what I'm trying to ask is, will this be a hard battle ahead, or will it actually be many rewards for the people who go in the front? I don't know if this is a suitable question.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good one. If we look at it through the lens of innovation, the diffusion of innovations, you know, if we look at open science as a change, which any innovation is a change in the current practice, we could argue that we're still in the phase where we have a few early adopters. You know, we certainly haven't reached critical mass. And if I think that through and think, okay, why is that the case? I think indeed we have bottom out quite a number of those early adopters and enthusiasts, you know, across the board. Top down, we now increasingly have a framework, but then most of us work in organizations, and organizations, you know, are difficult to change. And that's I think where a lot of it will come to the crunch, to really feed this not only from, you know, from UNESCO international policy, but raising awareness at organizational levels, so that we really have the supportive environment that we need in order to practice open science. You know, from a scientist perspective, quite a number of really practical obstacles come into play. If you're not well funded, then making your publications open access costs you 3,500 euros per publication, right? So if you don't have ready funds available, you need support from your management to buy into the fact that actually, as of now, ideally, you know, the policy of the Institute should be that all publications are open access, and then it's for management to find those resources, or to make sure that any future proposals, you know, write in the funds for open access. The same, as I said, the incentive systems for researchers at the end of the day on the ground, you know, to really practice open science. If there's a disconnect between what we're being measured on and how our careers advance compared to what open science strives for in terms of addressing societal needs and benefits, and all the extra effort that involves, but, you know, bringing people into the equation of doing science, you know, makes the scientific process quite a lot more complex, also very enriching, but more complex, more time consuming, more resource consuming. We need support. We need the infrastructure at organizational level at the end of the day. So what's it going to take? Yeah, it's really to embed it, you know, in the routines and procedures of research organizations. But as you saw, you know, the landscape of actors is rather big. The same is true for funders. If funders don't push and support and encourage us to practice open science, then, you know, we're still swimming against the stream rather than having support from the funder side. I hope that answers your question.
Jan, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm Jan Schmidt-Bauerkrona at the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management, and I'm working with the marine spatial planning, and I'm actually also co-leading a community of practice on ecosystem-based marine spatial planning
Right.
in the EMSP project. But I was thinking and inspired by your presentation, thinking about the parallel process of opening up marine management and planning, and also if you could elaborate on the linkages between opening up marine science to opening up marine management you see, also in relation to the public, because I think they could be kind of triangularly interlinked somehow.
Yeah, if I'd known you posed a question, I would have included a slide. I have a slide exactly on that, because the open science, of course, enhances two interfaces. It enhances the science policy interface, the way in which the scientific community interacts with the planning, the managers, the civil servants, etc. That interface is being enhanced, and also the public participation interface between management and authorities and the public, who now we often see that they find by opening up science and practicing citizen science, it's a much more concrete way of actually practicing that form of engagement that often the law asks for and the Aarhus regime asks for, in terms of not only access to environmental information but also participation. It makes it more concrete for many authorities. Having said that, it makes it also a lot, quite a bit scary and uncertain, because these changes of opening up decision-making processes and deciding not only who monitors which parameter in the environment, but also how that evidence is then taken on board in decision-making processes, and who should be part of those decision-making processes. We find that is a difficulty that many authorities are still working through. So we see two things happening. Either the doors are closed and they say, no, sorry, not interested, it's too scary for us, or the door is open. But often there is this sort of scary moment as you work with authorities, when they realize this is what it means, this is what it applies for my procedures and my processes, and I can't do them as fast as I'm used to, or I have to take on board these additional dialogues and engagement mechanisms and consultations, etc., and I have to write it up and justify it, etc. So they become aware of the complexity involved as they go through, and then sometimes the door shuts, but not always, and that's the hopeful part that we, from a scientific perspective, also try to work through. How can we really innovate participatory governance such that authorities don't have to shy away, but they find ways of also reinventing their role in this process. And one of those is being the quality controller of the data and the evidence, the different knowledge systems that now come to bear on the process, of actually doing more of the sense making there, compared to what they traditionally used to doing.
Thank you. So to which extent, I'm thinking, is this some sort of revolution, or or how much will management and planning change in the future based on more openness? Or
well, if you ask the idealist in me, I would say, well, all of it will change, and that's what I really hope for. I would say, with my more activist hat on, as a social scientist, I'm just too aware of the difficulties, and I know that this is a process. We have to learn to do things in this new way, and have to adjust organizational procedures, and that's a generic change management problem. Regardless of the thematic area of focusing on. Organizations can be quite heavy, in terms of resisting change and opening up and changing the ways in which things are done, in the most generic way, if you like. But I think the trend that we are seeing, it points in that way, but of course the path there is not an easy one. And that's why I think, as a scientific community, we have a lot to offer, to do this jointly, and not just leave responsibilities with authorities to say, yeah, but you must do this in a different way. That's exactly where the perhaps also in particular the social sciences have a lot to offer, to show how it can be done, to provide case studies and success examples of how it has been done. That helps others to follow the journey.
Okay, sounds good. So you will help us.
Sure.
At the authorities.
Yeah. Yeah, if I just may add, that's where the co-designed, the most collaborative form of citizen science and open science comes in, because what we had seen previously was that citizen science was done to arm citizens with data and then, you know, make their point towards authorities, that is not helpful. You know, arming anybody is not a good strategy. So what the co-design process does is that it brings authorities and other relevant stakeholders on board of the process from the start. You know, and sometimes they say, great, I'm informed now, tell me once you have results, and they back off a little bit, but you know, they're involved at arm's length and not so hands-on as typically the communities and citizens are. But it sets the scene in quite a different way, because at the end of the day, we're innovating not only how we generate data, but we're changing stakeholder relationships fundamentally. And you know, and that's not done by just presenting evidence on somebody's table and asking them to take it on board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Uta. And when you shared, I'm just thinking, like, because I'm also doing research, a scientist, scholar in some way, and I'm just thinking, in the context of business organizations, they talk about change of their process for innovation and how to deal with the resistance to change. And actually, in ICT context, there is a big body of research regarding how you deal with the resistance to new technology. Yeah. But I haven't really reflected about the scientific processes I adopt, like from the very beginning of idea generation to hypothesis design to data collection. Usually I or my collaborators, we are usually a small group of people. We do that ourselves. But with open science, the impression what I got is that, does that indicate we shall think about the stakeholders, for example, people who might be influenced by the results of the research? Or, for example, if the data collection involves certain group of people, maybe we even shall involve them earlier in the design stage of the study. And also maybe we also organize some systematic dissemination of our results.
Absolutely. Yes. So ideally, you know, that's the way to get stakeholders on board, and they can choose, you know, the extent to which they want to be involved and in which step. Giving people freedom to choose typically is a good strategy. Having said that, we don't always have those conditions. You know, I come back to the conditions under which we do research. You know, often the funding conditions just don't give us the time to build that in, or it's not, you know, what the funder is after. So those are some of the constraints that we have to work with. But in terms of practicing this, there's huge amounts of experience available, and that's also where in this whole development of the recommendation on open science, let's say the citizen science community has a huge amount of knowledge and expertise and practice to offer, because that's what the essence of citizen science is, you know, involving the public in scientific research, opening up one or more steps of the scientific method. There are theories, theoretical concepts, you know, advice, guidance, principles, and lots of case studies available. So that's really where there's this synergy between the citizen science community of practitioners of citizen science and the science of citizen science and the broader open science movement.
Thank you very much. And later, maybe I will write to you and ask for some references.
With pleasure.
To adopt the approach we would like to,
Yeah.
Frida, please.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you, Uta, in particular. It was super interesting. I'm a bit of an outsider here. I'm doing research on digital transformation in an organization in the forest industry. So I studied a little bit like the internal reorganization in terms of including employees in generating data, but it could well also include external stakeholders. And I think coming from digital transformation, I think an important shift when thinking about organizing and planning, as was raised, is this sort of rethink also at the management level, like what can be planned and what must we shift into view as a process. So something that was very prevalent in this case, that was about generating images and texts for an Instagram feed. So it was for a marketing purpose, not really a research purpose. But it was this, that it was like throughout this process more to continuously rethink what guidelines do we provide, what rules even, perhaps also sanctions if kind of rules or guidelines were violated. And that was very much ongoing. And I think that is an important shift at the management level, at least, to sort of also be, in a sense, proactive, but also reactive and engage throughout the process. And a challenge in that, I think also that I saw in that case was that how to also, because it's so sort of the thriving of this participation or engagement, I mean, that also need to be kind of intrinsic. So if you are to sort of to control in trying to govern that can also reduce engagement levels, and that can be super tricky. So those were some reflections about the organizational changes.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those. I think they're very illustrative, and it highlights the fact that a lot of the work that we do, let's say in the science of citizen science, actually focuses on stakeholder motivations. The motivations of the different stakeholders, of course, differ very much. You know, they're very different for citizens and the public to engage compared to scientists, compared to professional users, which we sometimes have, and authorities, etc. But even within those categories, of course, there's huge heterogeneity. You know, there's not just one thing that makes citizens tick and makes them involve, or the professional users for that matter. So I think, yeah, that diving down into those details and then reacting on them, right? Because an understanding of what drives motivations is information in order to then tailor engagement strategies and jointly move forward.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments or questions? Or have maybe some of our audience participants have already tried open science or citizen science approach in their research or work?
Yeah, that would be interesting to hear what your experiences are.
Yeah. Not yet. I know in ODF, the coaster, maybe the coaster example is something, it's definitely citizen science with the analysis of data. And another project which is ongoing, the killer algae project, involves the citizens with the data collection, but not yet with the data analysis. Yeah. But these are like typical approaches. I mean, now and how citizen science are integrated into research, but definitely from your sharing, open science is more than that. Yeah.
Yeah, so the examples you give is what we call contributory citizen science, because people contribute with their efforts, distinctly, typically with data collection, or in the Costa Sea Floor Observatory with data analysis. But that's it. They're very limited to one particular step in the scientific method. And we discussed, the broader approaches of collaborative and even co-designed approaches already, and how that changes relationships and dynamics, and therefore often also the uptake of the results.
Thank you. And please allow me to share the links where you can find out more about those projects I just mentioned, as both the coaster and the killer algae projects. Torsten, please.
Yes, this is a question perhaps to Swarm. As a researcher, one sometimes come across the question from management agencies like Swarm, and also from funders, what are the research questions that should be addressed? Is that possibly something related to open science? What would you say, Uta? Is that first minimal step that can be built upon? And perhaps should these questions be asked not as I understand they are typically now, too very much the insider group in academia and such. Perhaps I'm underestimating. Are those questions asked also to environmental conservation organizations and also?
Oh, you posed the question to SWAM, so I'll give the representatives from SWAM the floor.
Yeah, well, we have two. I have a colleague, Lars Johan, also on board here. I'm not sure if I understood. Do you mean to open up the science agenda, or I think that's a good approach, and I think we, at least internally, well, we pose those questions, but I'm not that sure. I don't have any. I mean, if we open up it for broad consultation with the stakeholder groups or so, it probably depends. Lars Johan, do you have anything to add?
No, I can't fill in much more on the process, but it's, I mean, it's discussed all over the, I mean, there's a process for doing when we support research for application and so on. So it's discussed, and there's an organization internally. How much, and that I believe relies on the communication that the different civil servants have with the community, but it's not an open forum that I've ever seen. And I'm not sure that is the most efficient in this case, because it's very easy to say that that you should sort of listen very carefully, but as an authority, we are governed by the Ministry of Environment. They are our employer, and of course we have to do the right thing, and there is an organization, but I can't fill in much more than Jan did there, but it's a nice thought at least.
Yeah, we can discuss whether it's about efficiency or effectiveness, you know, and that raises the question of who holds relevant knowledge. And the idea behind, let's say, the open science way of thinking is to say, in principle, everybody holds relevant knowledge. We've just found as a society different ways of tapping into this. We've agreed on the scientific method as the way in which we produce replicable scientific knowledge, but open science is there to sort of shake that a little bit, in the sense of saying, but don't forget these other knowledge holders, other knowledge systems, you know, that can have relevant insights for what you're doing. And so, yes, it may not be the most efficient way in terms of, you know, times and resources, but in terms of effectiveness of really addressing challenges that perhaps local communities have experienced and otherwise find difficult to share with the scientific community, then you can argue actually involving them at the first step, you know, when we devise the knowledge gap, the research agenda, the research questions, could be a good thing. You know, it could be very effective in terms of driving the production of scientific knowledge in the right direction of what is really addressing specific societal needs. Having said that, not all science is needs driven. You know, we have blue sky science, we have what we sometimes call basic science. Not all of it is driven by community. So it's all about finding a balance, you know, and it's not one size fits all. We don't have to suddenly throw everything open in every single project, but what the important thing is to know that this more comprehensive, more open way of doing science exists, to make a really good judgment and assessment, which part of our scientific process do we need to open for, given the context we're working in. I think that's important.
Yeah, so let me clarify a bit. I think we definitely have a lot of good tools to learn from what we heard today, not least. But it should be remembered that our governmental agency is not a research funding agency. That's not in our instructions to be that. And I should also clarify that we don't lock the doors and sit indoors and invent the questions. We have a lot of people out all the time, discussing with different stakeholders and bring that into the process. But it's mainly that me and Jan, we're not that close to that process. It's not our job. So we're unfortunately, we can't really represent that part of our agency really.
Thank you, Lars and John. Yes, we understand, and thank you for sharing your perspectives and views on that. Yeah. Okay. Any more comments or questions? If
Well,
not,
I got in at the
Martin.
last minute, sort of, but yeah. Anyway, I'm here now. But yeah, I saw that you recorded stuff, so perhaps I can have a look later. But yeah, seems like good stuff. So I'm at a consultant company here in Gothenburg, and most of the time I work on land, but perhaps with work waste that could be utilized elsewhere. So yeah, will there be a link to the meeting?
Yes, we will share the video through our YouTube channel.
Okay.
And you can watch it later, and also a short blog post on the webinars. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Can I come in with one last question then, seeing as Martin has introduced himself as a consultant, and how much of citizen science agenda will simply be taken over by profit-driven companies?
A lot, I think.
I mean, a question to you two. You didn't really mention this as hugely in, I mean, a massive force. We talked about citizen science, but are the consumers going to be citizens and governments and governance, or is it going to be profit?
It's going to be a mixture between things, I think, and people can go back and forth to the university.
Sorry, it's a question to Uta. I know.
I think it's a really good one. I think what we see so far is that industry's involvement is usually on the defensive side. We see a lot of citizen science that's focused on compliance, industrial requirements with legal environments as far as environmental protection is concerned. And we see that, you know, it can help them also to showcase their compliance. So it's not necessarily only a defensive relationship. Of course, those industrial parties that are compliant are more open to embracing citizen science, be it with data collection by the public, or indeed we heard also already the example of data collection by employees. That's not unusual. That's in fact often used also as a way of complying with social corporate responsibility, you know, creating more environmental awareness. So I do think there's a whole range of opportunities of engaging industry and citizen science. The extent to which industry takes over agendas and drives them, etc., you know, is a good question, but it could be equally posed about any other stakeholder. You know, we often hear concerns that saying, oh, the citizen scientists are all going to be full of activists, and you know, they're going to push these agencies in ways that they don't want to, etc. You know, that's why the view of citizen science as a process that needs to be carefully managed is really important. We need a whole particular skill set here. We're opening up the process to stakeholders that previously were not part of it, and those stakeholder dynamics need to be carefully managed. Yeah? So it's not one or the other, but that we find a reasonably democratic, fair process, you know, or it's clear when it's the science-driven in the science projects that the scientists will set the agenda in certain ways. All of that is clear, but we just need to be clear of the terms and conditions, if you like, under which we're doing citizen science.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Uta. I know you have a meeting starting soon. Yeah, but thank you so much. Yeah.